All right, let's jump right in. Today we're tackling psychedelic science.
It's a field that's definitely generating a lot of buzz these days.
Yeah, a lot of buzz and in controversy too.
Absolutely. I mean, we've got stacks of research about this, and it can be a lot to sift through.
That's why we're here, right? To break it all down.
Exactly. We'll navigate the ethical, legal, all those scientific debates around these, well, mind-altering substances. It's fascinating stuff.
It really is. And I think what's so interesting is, you've got this resurgence of interest in psychedelics.
Oh, absolutely. People are looking at them as potential therapeutic tools. It's incredible.
But then at the same time, there's this concern.
Right, this worry about misuse, what
Yeah.
happens as these compounds, these powerful compounds, get closer to the mainstream. It's a valid concern.
Yeah, definitely a tightrope walk. Because on one hand, you've got these studies showing, MDMA-assisted therapy.
Yeah, could be a game changer for PTSD.
Absolutely. I mean, some people are seeing symptom reduction even a year later.
It's remarkable.
And then you've got psilocybin showing real potential for treatment-resistant depression.
A huge unmet need, for sure.
It is. And these studies, like the ones from MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies,
Rigorously designed, very encouraging.
they are, but we have to balance the excitement, right?
Right, with a clear understanding of the risks involved. It's a delicate balance.
Before we get into those potential downsides, though, I'm curious about this idea of set and setting.
Yeah, the mindset and the environment during a psychedelic experience, crucial factors.
So if those factors are so crucial, could someone have, like, a bad trip even on a good psychedelic?
That's a great question, and it highlights why we can't just focus on the drug itself. You see, research using the psychedelic use scale has shown that people who go into the experience with positive intentions in a supportive setting, they tend to have much more beneficial outcomes.
Okay, so intention matters.
Absolutely it does. And on the flip side, those with problematic motivations, or if they're in unstable settings, they're much more prone to negative experiences. So yes, even psilocybin, which has amazing therapeutic promise, can have negative effects if the context isn't right.
So it's kind of like a recipe. You've got your ingredients, but how you combine them, what kind of oven you're using, it all matters.
I like that analogy, very fitting. And speaking of ingredients, to really grasp the potential and the peril of these substances, we need to look at the molecular level. How do psychedelics actually work in the brain?
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty, the chemistry set. We've got some info on two key players, 5-HT2A and NMDA receptors. Those are like the control panel for the psychedelic experience, right?
Precisely, they're crucial. David Nichols, his research has been so important for understanding this.
All right, so let's start with 5-HT2A. What are these receptors all about?
Well, think of them as tiny doorways on brain cells. When a psychedelic, let's say psilocybin, comes along, it acts like a key, unlocking these doors.
Unlocking the doors. And what happens then?
A whole cascade of effects. The altered perceptions, the feelings of interconnectedness, all those classic psychedelic experiences. 5-HT2A activation, it's what many scientists believe is at the heart of the psychedelic experience.
5-HT2A. Psychedelic Central, got it. But there's this thing called HPPD, which sounds kind of scary. Can you break that
So
down?
HPPD, yeah, that's a hallucinogen persisting perception disorder. Basically, it's like having visual echoes of a trip long after the drug has worn off.
Like flashbacks.
Kinda, but more like visual disturbances, seeing trails behind objects, flashes of patterns. Relatively rare, but it is a serious concern. And, Nichols's work has shown that 5-HT2A agonism, meaning the activation of those receptors, seems to be involved in the development of HPPD. It's complex, there's still a lot we don't fully understand, but knowing about these receptors is crucial.
Okay, so 5-HT2A is key to the psychedelic experience, but also potentially linked to HPPD.
Yeah.
Now, what about NMDA receptors? What role do they play in all of this?
NMDA receptors are another vital part of the brain's machinery. Learning, memory, a whole bunch of functions. But with psychedelics, the concern is with drugs that block these receptors. They're called NMDA antagonists.
So like ketamine.
Exactly. Ketamine is an NMDA antagonist. It can be a really valuable tool, especially in emergency medicine, pain management. But prolonged use, heavy use of NMDA antagonists raises concerns about potential neurotoxicity.
Neurotoxicity meaning damage to brain cells.
That's right. And again, Nichols' research helps us understand why. These NMDA receptors, they're essential for how neurons function. Disrupting that function, especially over a long time, could have unintended consequences.
So it's not just about the immediate effects of the trip. It's the potential long-term impact on the brain. This is starting to feel less like a fun roller coaster and more like navigating a minefield.
I see your point, and that's why understanding the pharmacology is so important. It goes beyond just good trip or bad trip. There's so much happening on a molecular level that we need to be aware of. Knowledge is power, as they say.
Okay, knowledge is power. So what are the key things people need to know to navigate this minefield, to do it safely?
Well, first, remember that risk is multifaceted. It's not just about the drug itself, it's the dose, frequency of use, the individual's susceptibility, and any pre-existing mental health conditions they might have. It's a complex recipe.
So someone with a history of, let's say, anxiety or psychosis, they might be at higher risk.
Exactly. That's why the protocols used in clinical trials, like the MDMA-assisted therapy trials, are so rigorous. Careful screening, controlled doses, supportive settings. It's all about minimizing the risks.
It sounds like a very different approach than what we often see in, say, recreational settings.
Absolutely. And speaking of different settings, there's another layer of complexity here, the ethics of therapists who have personal experience with psychedelics.
Ah, that paper by Nielsen and Guess. Yeah, it was a fascinating read. It's a really tricky situation, isn't it? On one hand, you could argue that firsthand experience might make a therapist more empathetic, more understanding.
Right, they could relate better.
But then there's the concern about objectivity, professional boundaries.
It's a thorny issue, no doubt, and it's something the field is actively wrestling with, especially as more therapists become interested in incorporating psychedelics into their practices.
So it's not just the science, the pharmacology, but the human element too. The ethics of how these substances are used in a therapeutic context.
Precisely. And we can't forget the influence of culture either. Responses to psychedelics, they can be shaped by ethnicity, cultural factors, both the subjective experience and even how the drugs are metabolized.
Wait, really? Cultural background can influence how your body processes a psychedelic.
Absolutely. There was a study, Ang Amar and colleagues, they showed how genetic and cultural factors can have a big influence on psychopharmacology. Some research suggests that certain populations might metabolize drugs differently, experience side effects at different rates.
Wow, so we've got this intricate interplay of pharmacology, personal experience, cultural influences. It's like a tapestry, each thread contributing to the overall picture.
Exactly. And that tapestry will become even more intricate as psychedelic research continues.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. The potential therapeutic benefits, those receptor-specific risks, strategies for safer use, and even touched on the ethical and cultural considerations. It's a lot to digest, but I feel like we're starting to get a handle on this multifaceted world.
It's just the tip of the iceberg, really. But I hope this deep dive has given you a good foundation, a way to understand the complexities of psychedelic science.
Definitely. But before we wrap things up for this part of the deep dive, I have one more question for you.
Okay, shoot.
We've seen the immense promise of psychedelics, but also the crucial need for caution, for scientific rigor. Given all this interplay of factors, what ethical framework do you think should guide the future of psychedelic research, of psychedelic therapy? It's something to really think about.
That's a profound question, and the answers will have ripple effects far beyond the lab. But for now, let's take a break and delve deeper into some more fascinating aspects of psychedelic science in the next part of our deep dive.
Welcome back. Okay, so we covered a lot in part one, but one thing that's been on my mind is the legal side of things, the laws around psychedelics.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other can of worms, right?
Yeah.
Incredibly complex, and it changes all the time.
It does. It's like, in the U.S., most psychedelics are still Schedule 1, high potential for abuse, no accepted medical use.
Right, that's the federal classification.
But then you have places like Portugal where all drugs have been decriminalized.
Huge difference in approach, and even within the U.S., things are shifting.
Yeah, some cities have decriminalized psilocybin. Oregon's even legalized it for therapeutic use. Supervised settings, of course.
It's a fascinating evolution, right? You have these deep-seated views of psychedelics as dangerous drugs, but then this growing body of evidence suggesting they could be valuable tools, especially for mental health.
Absolutely. So it's like this tug-of-war almost between those old views and the new research.
That's a good way to put it. And often the science is moving faster than the law.
Which creates challenges for researchers, for therapists.
For everyone, really. It's like trying to figure out the rules of a game while the game board keeps changing.
Right. But even with those legal hurdles, the research that IF's being done is showing some pretty interesting results.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just clinical trials. There's so much happening in neuroscience, neuroimaging. It's really giving us a window into how psychedelics affect the brain.
It's like, remember that study from Stanford?
Yeah.
The one where they found that psilocybin can actually decrease activity in the amygdala? The part of the brain linked to fear and anxiety.
Yeah. Incredible findings.
It really is. And that could have major implications for treating all sorts of conditions.
Anxiety, depression, maybe even addiction.
It's like we're getting a glimpse into the inner workings of the brain, how consciousness works. It's mind-blowing.
It is. And psychedelic research, it's not just about new treatments. It's about understanding the human mind better. It's like this journey of self-discovery, but on a societal scale.
I love that, a societal journey of self-discovery. But as we go down this path, we have to remember the lessons of history, right?
Absolutely. Psychedelic research has had its ups and downs, breakthroughs and missteps. We need to learn from both.
So things like informed consent, responsible use, making sure we're not sensationalizing or overhyping the benefit.
Exactly. Enthusiasm is great, but we need healthy skepticism too.
It's a tightrope walk, but I think if we can maintain that balance, the future of psychedelic science is incredibly promising.
I agree, but it'll take collaboration. Scientists, therapists, policymakers, the public, we all need to work together to make sure this benefits everyone, both individuals and society as a whole.
We're all in this together, and having these open, honest conversations like we are right now, that's crucial.
Couldn't agree more. The more we understand about the risks, the benefits, the better decisions we can make, about psychedelic use, about policies, we need to go into this with our eyes wide open.
Okay, so we've talked about the therapeutic potential, the legal stuff, the amazing science happening, but there's one more thing I want to touch on, the social and cultural implications.
Yes, it's not just a scientific phenomenon, it's cultural too.
Sure.
And that raises some big questions about how these substances could impact society down the line.
It does. Like, how will changing attitudes towards psychedelics affect our views on mental health, on spirituality, even personal freedom? It's a lot to consider.
It is. No easy answers. We're really in uncharted territory here. And those social and cultural implications, they're just starting to play out.
It's exciting and a little daunting, you know? Where do we even start to unpack all of this?
Well, I think acknowledging the historical and cultural significance of these substances is a good starting point. Psychedelics, they've been used for centuries in so many cultures, for spiritual purposes, medicinal, ritualistic.
Right, like the ayahuasca traditions in South America, the use of peyote in Native American ceremonies. This isn't some new fad. It's part of human history.
Exactly. And those traditions remind us that psychedelics aren't just chemicals, they're woven into the fabric of human experience.
And that context, that cultural context, is so important for understanding how these substances are perceived, how they're used. The same substance can mean different things to different people, be used in completely different ways, depending on the cultural lens.
Absolutely. And as psychedelics become more mainstream, it'll be really interesting to see how those cultural interpretations evolve, how they interact.
Do you think we'll see a blending of those ancient traditions with the modern scientific approaches? Or will completely new cultural paradigms emerge?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Impossible to predict for sure, but it's definitely something to think about. And it highlights how important it is to approach this field with cultural sensitivity, respect for different viewpoints. There's no one-size-fits-all when it comes to psychedelics.
I agree. We can't impose our own biases on how others choose to use these substances or relate to them.
Exactly. And that respect, it needs to extend beyond cultural boundaries, too. We need to think about the bigger picture, a broader sense of ethical responsibility.
You mean like it's not just about respecting different cultures, but recognizing that we have a responsibility to use these substances in a way that benefits humanity as a whole.
Precisely. We need to consider the impact of psychedelics on everything. Individual well-being, social justice, even environmental sustainability. It's a holistic view.
Wow. So it's not just the individual effects of these substances, it's their potential to influence the course of human civilization.
It sounds dramatic, but I don't think it's an overstatement. This resurgence of interest in psychedelics, it has the potential to be a huge paradigm shift. We need to be ready for that, ready to navigate the ripple effects.
It's almost like we're standing at the edge of this vast, uncharted ocean.
I like that.
We can see the potential for amazing discoveries, transformation, but we also know there are hidden depths, challenges we can't even anticipate yet.
That's a beautiful analogy. It really captures what makes this field so compelling and so challenging. We're venturing into the unknown, and that requires both courage and humility.
It does. We need to be open to new ideas, willing to challenge old assumptions, but also acknowledge the limits of what we know right now.
It's a tough balance to strike, but I think it's a balance worth striving for. If we can approach psychedelic science with open minds, with compassion, with that shared commitment to well-being, I think we can navigate those uncharted waters and come out on the other side in a better place.
I love that. That's a great note to end on. And it brings us back to that question we posed earlier. What ethical framework do you think should guide the future of psychedelic research and therapy? Something to really sit with.
It is a question worth pondering. And maybe, if you're listening, you can share your thoughts with us too.
We'd love to hear them. But for now, we're going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll be diving into some of the emerging trends, the unanswered questions that are shaping the future of psychedelic science. So stay tuned.
And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into psychedelic science. It's been quite a journey so far.
It has lots to think about.
Pearl.
All the potential, but all the uncertainties too. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But that's what makes this so fascinating, right? This feeling that we're on the cusp of something big, a real paradigm shift.
It's like we're finally starting to see these substances for what they could be. Not just dangerous drugs, but tools for healing, for understanding ourselves better.
Exactly. It's like peeling back layers, you know, history, science, culture, it all comes together. But there's still so much we don't know, so many questions.
And that's the exciting part, right? Figuring it all out. The next few years are going to be crucial for this field. We could see some major breakthroughs. But the decisions we make now, those are going to shape the future of psychedelic science for a long time.
No pressure then. But yeah, I feel like a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of those emerging trends, those unanswered questions that are out there. One thing that strikes me is the sheer variety of psychedelic substances. We've mostly focused on MDMA and psilocybin, but those are just two examples.
Oh yeah, there's a whole universe of psychedelic compounds out there, each one with its own quirks, its own risks and benefits. Like, remember we mentioned salvinorin, the active compound in salvia divinorum?
Yeah, salvia. That's a whole other story.
It is totally different than something like LSD or psilocybin. Salvinorin A mainly acts on kappa opioid receptors.
Right, not those serotonin receptors we talked about before.
Totally different pathway. And the experiences people have with salvinorin A, well, they can be pretty different too.
I've heard. Intense, short-lived, not always pleasant.
Exactly. It just shows that we can't lump all these substances together. Psychedelics, that's a broad term. We need to be more specific, understand the nuances of each compound.
So, like, we need a new vocabulary almost, a new way of categorizing them.
Maybe. And as we learn more about those specific mechanisms, how each one works in the brain, we'll be able to develop more targeted therapies, tailor them to specific conditions.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Which brings me to another question. What are the limits of psychedelic therapy? We've seen amazing results, but are there some conditions that it just doesn't work for?
It's a good question, and we don't have all the answers yet. We know psychedelic-assisted therapy shows promise for PTSD, depression, addiction, but more research is needed, for sure, to see if it's effective for other conditions, to figure out who might not be a good candidate.
To find out where the boundaries are, basically.
Right, and it's not just about individual differences. We need to think about the big picture, the societal implications. Like, how will this impact the healthcare system? Will everyone have access to these therapies?
Access and equity, those are key issues. It can't just be another treatment that's only available to the wealthy. And that actually brings up another concern I have. Commercialization, the potential for exploitation.
Yeah, the dark side of the psychedelic gold rush. There's definitely a risk there.
As interest in psychedelics grows, there's going to be more and more money flowing in. Pharmaceutical companies, wellness retreats, you name it.
Everyone wants a piece of the pie.
Exactly. And that's where things can get tricky, right? We have to make sure those profit motives don't overshadow the real goals, the therapeutic goals, the ethical considerations.
Finding that balance is going to be crucial. How do we protect the integrity of these substances, honor their traditional uses, but also allow for innovation, for accessibility? It's a tough one.
It is. It's going to require a multi-pronged approach, I think.
Yeah.
Strong ethical guidelines for research, for therapy, smart regulations to prevent abuse, and public education is huge.
Oh, absolutely. The more people understand about these substances, the risks and benefits, the better equipped they'll be to make informed decisions, to advocate for good policies.
It all comes back to education. And not just the science, but the cultural and historical context, too. The ethics, the potential societal impacts.
A holistic understanding. That's what we need.
Right, one that acknowledges both the healing potential and the potential for harm.
That's the key, isn't it? We need to go into this with our eyes wide open.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, but one thing's clear. This is just the beginning of the psychedelic story.
The Renaissance is here, and it's an exciting time to be involved in this field. But it's not just about science, right? It's about re-examining our relationship with consciousness, with reality itself.
Whoa, deep thoughts. I love it. I really think the discoveries we make in this field are going to be transformative, not just for our understanding of the brain, but for how we see ourselves, how we understand what it means to be human.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So, to everyone listening, keep exploring, stay curious, stay compassionate, and don't be afraid to ask tough questions.
The journey's just getting started. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.